Let's talk.
John Brown.
Mismanaged decline. What politicians won't tell you about the economy. How did the UK transition from being one of the world's workshop to having a dependent, service-driven economy of today, prone to severe negative shocks and daunting economic changes? In Mismanaged Design, Vicky Pryce and Andy Ross look at the situation that led the UK to be where it is. Here, I'd like to say that Vicky joins me line on the line now. Vicky, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So for those of you who don't know, why are you and Andy so eminently qualified to write Mismanaged Decline?
It's a very good question, actually. The thing is that we're both experienced both in the private sector and in the public sector. We were public servants for a while, and that's how we met. I was joint head of the Government Economic Service and Director General in one of the government departments for trade and industry. And Andy Ross was at the Treasury managing the Government Economic Service for me and my head. So we met that way. He's an academic. I had worked for the private sector before I joined the government. So I was in the banking sector, then in the energy sector. Then I worked for an accounting consulting firm, KPMG, where I was a partner, and then joined the civil service rather late after having had those experiences. And what I found was obviously quite a different environment to what I was used to. And I was used to advice from the outside to get them to do the right things. And then I found myself inside doing the same thing, if you like, but with help from people from sort of external organizations. And so when we both left and went back to him being an academic and me working for the private sector, we have collaborated on a few projects together, but we have become increasingly worried about the fact that evidence-based policy seems to be abandoned. So in other words, policy making is based more on ideology rather than anything else, and it isn't helping the economy at all. So we thought we'd explain all the problems that the UK has had, the reason why it's moved to being more a service-led economy rather than what it was before, and looking at the mistakes that have been made all across different types of governments, and leading us today to a situation where there's very little growth and real concerns about what the UK might do next, hence the book.
So presumably this is a book that takes a long-term view, and there are no quick fixes per se, because if you're looking at a decline, it's not something that, purely a piece of political rhetoric, we can fix this, broken Britain, etc., is going to fix, and we have to take a long-term view to work out how the UK got to quote unquote the state that it is in. Vicky.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing to bear in mind is that the UK did grow, quite significantly when you look towards the end of the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution there, starting really in the UK, making the UK the workshop, if you like, of the world. That was also, of course, accompanied by the fact that we still had colonies and were able to really benefit from those. And so slowly, of course, all that stayed in place for a large part of the 19th century, but we started, losing some of those because of decolonization that took place. And also, of course, the fact that there were other big nations that were coming into prominence, particularly the emergence of the United States as a major power in the world, and also able, of course, to produce quite a lot, and also quite sort of independent, self-reliant energy and so on. It's been able, therefore, to forge ahead without sort of worrying too much about anyone else. And we see that actually happening right now as well, in the present day. And then, of course, losing the colonies, what happened, particularly after the Second World War, and the emergence even more strongly of places like the US and, of course, China in terms of industrial forces too, not just in terms of the numbers of people who live there, has left the UK in a situation where it's now, quite isolated in some ways. It's left the EU as well. So that's another way in which its power has been diminished, because it's not really part of a bigger whole that can exercise that power. And the move, the deindustrialization that was caused partly because of the emergence of other powerful countries. And we see that now, of course, particularly with China and the competition there. But we had Japan before, South Korea and so on. But also because of the over-reliance that we found ourselves in, and then we discovered how bad that was on services, particularly the financial sector, and what happened with the financial crisis, which of course brought us back to reality that perhaps we needed a more balanced economy. And that's where we are now, I think, looking at ways to change that structure, taking in AI and everything else, but maybe a little bit too late to adjust the way we'd like to see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, you've covered so many bases there, Vicky. I mean, let's start. Can we not argue then that basically you talk about it being the world's workshop, but then we had, Great Britain had colonies for better or worse or whatever, and then you have that takes us like neatly to the end of the Edwardian age, but the thing is, in the 30s we have. The Second World War is a force multiplier for American industrialization. And when they do get involved, they turn the whole, if you like, as the Soviets do, their whole production into a war fitting. And therefore, suddenly the Americans are allowed to take a quantum leap in terms of manpower manufacturing. And obviously, the UK and Europe in general has been wrecked by the Second World War, and therefore it's a place that the UK is doubly wrecked by the manpower thing, but also the loss of colonies, not the loss of colonies, but the people pushing for independence. It's part of goes hand in glove, and therefore, the UK is caught in that sort of perfect storm of a shrinking pool of labour or manufacturing or raw goods they can get in, even on trade deals. Well, the Americans have this huge experience. To a large extent, they're untouched by war, and that's why America booms in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that gives and that inevitably wrecks the UK in terms of a world power position, but also in its manufacturing position. Albeit shipyards, albeit mining, or whatever.
You're absolutely right. And that's really what has indeed been happening. And of course, the whole of Europe was depending on the Marshall Plan afterwards and the help that the US has provided, because indeed, there was a bit of devastation after the Second World War. And of course, we had the divisions in Europe with the Soviet bloc, which took quite a lot of productive capacity out of the European economy. And it's really rather interesting because I worked a lot in Eastern Europe after the wall came down in 89. So the wall in Berlin, which separated West and East Berlin. And then, of course, the floodgates opened and loads of people moved both directions, but mostly leaving the Soviet Union. And then gradually we've integrated quite a lot of those countries into the EU as well. So, and that, of course, in many ways, it took away a lot of the potential productive capacity, because it was really interesting. When we went into those countries, when the OECD, all those various organizations, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the sort of club of developed nations, was doing quite a lot of analysis of what was happening in those economies. And then, of course, they seem to be quite well off and rich. And you looked at East Germany, and it looked like it was really doing rather well. And then when you went in to those countries, you realized that a lot of what they were producing was produced basically for Russia, for part of the Soviet Union. It wasn't saleable at all because of the quality to the West at all. So it all had to be, in a strange sort of way, recreated with a lot of investment going into those countries and huge amounts of money, of course, from West Germany to former East Germany to sort of bind them together, especially when they all came back together as one country. So all that, you're absolutely right, that Europe, which, of course, had been, very strong in the past, was very badly hit by the war. And, of course, the UK, in a way, did maintain quite a lot of its strength on the manufacturing front. But there is no doubt that not having Europe next door doing, really, really well as perhaps it would have done before, and having all these competitors emerging, particularly in the Far East, has been an issue. Losing all these colonies, as you rightly said, added to it. So the question for us in the book was, what can you do in those circumstances? And quite a lot of what was done didn't necessarily help retain this competitive position. Yes, of course, we went through all sorts of phases of trying things out, like privatizing, the Big Bang.
Yes.
Everything happened under Margaret Thatcher, which we thought was perhaps going to be the case. And we also missed completely the fact that we were losing out on productivity, because if you lose quite a lot of those big sectors, manufacturing, which of course you tend to export a lot of, more than you do on services generally, you don't get that productivity sort of boost given, because when you export or you compete and people sell things to you as well, or you're part of the EU in the single market, you have to invest a lot more to remain competitive. Or you also know that you've got people who can come in, as what's happening during the period we were in the EU, which is over 40 years. And it didn't restrain or constrain your ability to increase your production, because you could just bring people in and have economies of scale, the sort of thing that the microeconomists tell you about. You've got to produce in bulk, because that way you reduce your average cost and then you become more competitive. And to become more competitive, you need to innovate. You lose a lot of that if you just move into a situation where you're relying a lot less on that type of stimulus and more on what we had come to do just before the financial crisis, which is, let's look at the financial sector. It's going to save us. I mentioned that a few minutes ago, but the way you calculate productivity, which is one of the problems that we've all had. All industrial nations since the financial crisis have seen less growth in productivity, in the West anyway, than before, because a lot of investment was sucked out of it, is that we look at what is paid in various sectors. So you mentioned some of the sectors yourself, whether it was, of course, in manufacturing or the chemicals industry, for example. We had mining, of course, but also we had oil and gas, which was quite important in the UK. And you looked at shipbuilding, aerospace, those all paid quite high dollar, if you like, for per hour. That's how you determine whether it's highly productive. If you pay a lot for a certain person to work in it, then it must be high productivity sector. And we looked at the financial sector, which was, of course, paying an awful lot. A lot more than in the rest of the economy, mostly. And we assumed that that's a productive sector. And then came the shock of the financial crisis, and we realized that actually maybe we had put too many eggs in one basket and we needed to diversify, and the attempts to do that haven't really necessarily succeeded so far, and that's the problem looking ahead.
Could you argue this point, right, and here we go, that since the Thatcherism experiment, everything's going to be privatised, right? Everything going to be privatised, private prisons, buy your own council house, you remember this, that and the other, and the shock that had, and also the way, and this on a European scale, you talk about Germany and East Germany, and I would have quite liked to have bought a Trabant, but we assumed that market forces would put a level of, would raise the living standards of all of quote unquote Eastern Europe. So East Germany, Romania, Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia was the time, even the former Soviet Union would embrace Western principles, and therefore we'd all be one big happy family. The harsh realities, however, have come back to bite one in the proverbial sort of stock market. The effect that these, and ever since then we've had these almost empty slogans by saying, for example, the gig economy, right, and the financial services, we're going to become a service-orientated business. Nothing wrong with that, but to throw that as a sort of as a salve to solve the complex international geopolitical problems of a nation such as the UK, plus the Brexit situation is never going to work out. There is no one quick fix, and I think the politicians perhaps don't understand and think like gig economy, and you remember that famous ballerina advert, is that so and so's future is in the gig economy. She just doesn't know it yet. Well,
yes.
That's fine, but it only works for 0.01% of the population, as does becoming a financial services agency. Vicky.
No, you're quite right. I mean, I think I heard you saying you wish you had bought a Trabant.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Well, we were. I come from Greece originally, and we were the only family I knew who had a Trabant.
Wonderful.
It was one of those, you had to sort of, every now and then it sort of would stop working, and you had to more or less wind the engine up again in order to get it to work. But it was one of those strange things that my father decided to give my mother a present, and he gave her a Trabant, which was a bit of a shock to the system, I have to say. But in terms of all the other issues that you mentioned, yes, we seem to be making a similar mistake now, in that if you if anyone, was bothering to look in detail, and many people have done, the latest budget of Rachel Reeves, who's now a chancellor since Labour won in 2024. One of these sectors that seems to, or the sector that seems to have been let off the hook, if you like, in terms of seeing any serious increases in taxes, which had been coming down under the Conservatives, and also the sectors that are seeing more deregulation. It's the financial sector, again, that is seen as the one that's going to save us. So yes, of course, there is a certain amount of borrowing that the public sector is doing to invest in loads of industries through a new industrial policy across the UK. But it's not huge by any means, and it does depend on getting businesses feeling more confident to go out and invest themselves, because obviously they won't be able to do it single-handedly. But the issue is that the financial sector and the deregulation that's happening are worrying people that we might end up with yet another crisis. And they've been making huge profits recently, and it seems odd that once again, this is the sector which this government, the Labour government, seems to think is going to be the one that's going to save us.
Yeah, but the problem with us, I mean, this is trickle-down economics, and it didn't really work for Reaganomics. It didn't really work, for Thatcher. And the problem that we are seeing throughout Europe is since the pandemic as well, a lot of people had an awful lot of time on their hands. The advent of social media and the internet, I mean, there are the wilder fringes of quote unquote information, false news. And if you are left out of this seemingly Instagram-friendly world where people are leaping on private yachts or planes with beautiful girlfriends, you're going to go, well, why aren't I getting any of this? Oh, it's because of the elites, and we want, or it's the immigrants, for example, and we want our, we want it to go back to what it was before the war, etc. And you get this populist viewpoint on economics, and it's, and that makes things very, very difficult to have a nuanced conversation, or to have some marked change, some hard and readjustments and reboots, Vicky.
Well, yes, and especially when you see that, in fact, real disposable incomes are increasing very, very slowly in the UK, and that's a concern, because taxes are going up. There's been this freezing of allowances from where you start paying tax, which is now carrying on to supposedly to 2031, by which time, of course, we will have had another election. So who knows? So people do feel aggrieved, and there is a concern also about wealth inequality. And what you find is that despite the fact that wages are increasing and minimum wage has gone up again, and quite significantly, has gone up now for quite a few years, what you find is that people don't have much confidence in going out and spending. But the fact that suddenly the voting intentions are such that quite a lot of more extreme parties seem to be attracting a lot of votes, if you believe the opinion polls, then you see that there is that discontent of the type that your question is suggesting, which is then going into parties that they think might, in fact, deal with those issues for them. And of course, that also, if you feel discontented, then it leads into views about migration, which are not particularly positive, and so on. So there is definitely discontent as a result of a series of policies that have left people, feeling maybe sort of impoverished, or certainly not doing as well as they had hoped for. And indeed, all those images of the elites, if you want to call them that, are not helping. So
when you say the book is, the subtitle is What Politicians Won't Tell You About the Economy, are they not telling you that because they're in a secret cabal, or are they not telling you that because they're scared to actually confront you with the brutal truth and the fact that you've got to go through a bit of a grind if you want to get your economy back on track? Why are politicians not telling us about the economy, Vicky? Well, the main thing that we're trying to say, the main message about what they're not telling us, is that they're often promising you things which are not necessarily based on evidence. And our view is that ideology should not be part of politics when it comes to economic decisions that are being made. And there is always the worry that
our politicians are not necessarily economists. I mean, my view is that obviously I'm biased. The more economists there are working at the top of the government, the better it is. But not that all economists agree with each other, of course, and that needs to be said quite clearly. But it is more the worry that a lot of that evidence is just ignored. So I can give you a number of examples. I can give you certainly one, which
Please
is...
do.
Everything to do with the Rwanda policy, where we had this idea in the previous government of having, so I'm not just talking about Labour Party here and the Labour government, but also what to get to the point we're in terms of mismanaged decline, which is what the book is talking about. There have to have been lots of mistakes and loads of times when the government has ignored advice from economists. So, or from evidence. It doesn't have to be economists. So the Rwanda policy, the Home Office of sending illegal migrants to Rwanda.
Yes, Suella Braverman's dream, quote unquote. Remember, if you her obsession.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Home Office had said very clearly that it was bad value for money, and that was ignored. So what tends to happen in the UK, as I'm sure you know, is that if the advice is that you shouldn't be doing something because it's not good for the government, for the public finances, and it's not going to lead to the results you want, then if the politicians don't want to listen to you, because you've got to do that analysis, because it's part of running the government, and lots of committees in Parliament are going to be asking you, and the National Audit Office will ask you all sorts of questions. The minister can say, I'm giving you direction. I don't care what you say. This is what's going to happen. So you absolve the particular government or the particular government department from any responsibility, because you said, right, I want it done anyway. So they went ahead and tried to do that anyway, and quite a lot of money was wasted as a result. And we got loads of examples of a lot more money. So, for example, the Employment Rights Bill, which is going through, well, that's going to be costing, according to government analysis, about £5 billion a year to businesses once it gets implemented, which is going to be happening from the beginning of next financial year. And then all the new stuff on much more expensive visas coming in, which has been calculated to cost businesses 40 billion over 10 years. I mean, this is huge amounts of money, which the analysis tells you shouldn't be going ahead and doing something, and they're still going ahead because they believe that maybe the electorate wants it, or because of ideology, or because they think differently to what the analysis is telling you. So those are the types of mistakes. And you mentioned privatization. Again, we found in many areas that it hasn't worked particularly well at all. For example, in the water utilities side, where there are huge debts, infrastructure spending hasn't happened to the extent it should have happened, loads of pollution, etc., etc. And I can sort of expand that to so many sectors of the economy where government has done various things, even though perhaps rational and also evidence-based policy would have told you don't go there.
Because I suppose, and I'm not going to get on my soapbox and start singing the Internationale, though the time's very tempting, but obviously with a private company, you can say all the nice things you like, but your first duty is to your shareholders and to return a maximum profit. And therefore, in some certain industries, perhaps like utilities, that shouldn't be in the best interests of the population themselves, Vicky.
There should have been stricter regulation, and one of the things we do talk about in the book is whether we should look at that again. In fact, actually, this government is looking at some of them. So, for example, the water regulator, we don't know what's going to happen to that one, and many others, really, which have allowed all sorts of things to be happening, which they should have intervened in and made sure that private sector firms worked under stricter conditions.
If there's a light at the tunnel, is it not the light of a delayed private-owned train coming down the rails from Great Western? I mean, when you publish a book like this, Vicky, is there cause for optimism, or should we be just getting our trust funds and heading out to the Caribbean at the end of the day?
Well, there is cause for optimism. I think there is quite a lot about the UK economy that we can celebrate, right. And there are some sectors which are strong. What we want to make absolutely certain is that they don't become weaker. So those, of course, include, there's a certain amount of quite good advanced manufacturing. If you look at the health sector, life sciences, really strong. and we need to support them. Frankly, even if you go into oil and gas, renewables and so on, we have considerable strength in those too, and we should exploit all that and explore all that in the best possible way and not put all sorts of constraints on that. So we need to be aware of what the impact of various decisions are, the unintended consequences of even net zero. We need to just watch that. We've got a very active creative sector, and we can do more on that. And of course, business services and services more generally, not just the financial sector. And quite a lot of what's happening now in terms of trying to have a reset with Europe is looking at a number of those areas and saying, how can we improve the trade with Europe in a way that actually helps our people and increases competition, increases productivity as well. So there is hope if we finally seeing sense. I mean, the Brexit decision is now acknowledged by the vast majority of the population to have been a mistake, has not given us any benefits, it's actually made things worse. And a gradual reversal of that could help, but also seriously looking at the sectors where we have the strength. And if it means cooperating with other countries, yes, we should do it, whether it's Europe or whether it's countries in the Far East or whether it's even with the US in a way that benefits us rather than being against us. There are all sorts of things that can be done, but it requires leadership.
The book is called Mismanaged Decline, What Politicians Won't Tell You About the Economy. It's by Vicky Pryce and Andy Ross. Vicky, if people want to find you online and say nice things to you, where's the best place to find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter and also LinkedIn. So it's easy to find me. On Twitter is @real Vicky Pryce. So it's more or less the same with LinkedIn. So I can be found and would love any comments. Thank you.
Well, it's been great. And listeners, you can go onto our own TRE virtual bookstore. Go to TRE.radio. You'll see a picture of the front cover. Click on that, and a well-known distribution service. It'll be winging its way to you. This book is called Mismanaged Decline, What Politicians Won't Tell You About the Economy. Vicky, it's been absolutely fascinating to speak to you this morning. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Great talking to you.